Right. So we've looked at importing an SVG into HTML, embedding the SVG code itself directly into HTML. Now let's have a look at uh, making a linear gradient. Let's have a look at that. So what I've done here is I've got my SVG that I just made before, and I've duplicated it, and I've just given it a different name. Okay, and I've opened it up in Illustrator as well. Now, in the process of saving this out from Illustrator, I am going to lose my custom class names. They're not my custom color values, uh, but that's okay because when I integrate it back into my HTML, I can swap out those class names again. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to click on my blob shape here. And note that I do still have those ID that I have before, the names of the different paths in my layers here. So I'm just opening the blob there, and I'm going to go to the gradient panel down here. And what I'm going to do is just give it some kind of a gradient here. Might rotate it, say 90 degrees, something like that. Let's give it a different orange at the top. Something like that. That'll do nicely. Okay, good. So we've only got two color stops here. So that should come through into Illustrator or into uh, Visual Studio Code rather when I open up the SVG code as a linear gradient with two color stops, this sort of lighter orange here and this darker orange down there. So let's just save that, the Command S. All right, it did warn me it's been modified outside Illustrator. That's fine. Okay, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. All right, so we'll just, actually, I'll just open that up directly here. Shape morph dash gradient. All right, so let's have a look at the code here. So you can see that Illustrator has indeed replaced my nice human-friendly class names with ones that it likes. We have a difference of opinion here on how CSS classes should be named. Not going to win that particular argument, except, of course, I am going to win it because I'm going to impose my own class names. Screw you, Illustrator. Okay, so notice that we've still got a defs section up here. We've got the style element here, and outside that, we've got something new. We've got this linear gradient code block here. Okay, so that is defining that linear gradient. If I just sort of click once on this here, you can see that that's what's giving me that gradient through there. That's all fine. All right, let's have a look at that. So it's got some coordinates here. We can probably actually pretty safely wipe those out. And we've got this stop element here. Okay, and you can see it has an offset value 0 and 1, and it also has a color value. Stop color equals blah blah, that orange. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually bring this into my HTML and wire it up with the CSS. But there's one other thing we need to note. Okay, let's have a look at where blob 1 is. That's the shape that actually has this gradient applied to it. So path ID equals blob 1. Notice that it has this CSS class equals st1. All right, so let's have a look up here at that definition. Previously, it just had fill with a kind of a colored definition, the orange. But notice that this class here now says URL, hashtag, meaning ID, linear gradient. Okay. So that's, if you like, wiring up this object, the ID linear gradient, with this. Okay. So we can actually rename that ID. I think it's a pretty good idea too, because my final illustration might wind up using loads of different gradients. Let's call it blob1 gradient. Okay, and if I copy that up here, we'll see that that will in fact work perfectly well. All right, so if we have a look over here, you can see that is working perfectly. So long as these two names match up in the field URL, and it has that ID blob1 dash gradient, that hash blob1 dash gradient, as long as that's the same as this, that will work. If I change that to something else, like let's call it, give it an idea of nonsense. All right, that should break that. You can see that there's no fill at all in that shape there now. Okay, so they do need to be the same. Provided they're the same, this will work. And in fact, what you'll see is that if we put this URL value into our CSS, that will still also work. Okay, so I don't need to actually bring any of these shapes in. They're all fine. I don't need to worry about actually even the class names here. I can continue to use my custom class names. But what I do need to bring over is this linear gradient block. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that. Come back to my HTML file. You might remember from the last video that I suggested leaving that defs block in place there. After all, if it's empty, it's empty. It's no harm. But it's there if we need to use it to do something like this, populate it with something like a linear gradient block. Okay, again, I'm just going to fix up the indentation there with command right square bracket. Okay, that should be fine. All right, so far, this is going to look exactly the same. It still has that flat fill because the blob1 shape, this starfish shape, still has that blob1 class, which of course is defined not inside the SVG, but as in the last video, in the CSS, in my SVG section here. Blob1, fill, and in this case it has that orange. Now I'm going to change that though. So I've got this linear gradient block here. I do have to keep that in my SVG. This will not come into my CSS. You can see that it does in fact look more like HTML. What I am going to do though is I'm going to copy that ID name for that gradient. So blob1 dash gradient. I'm going to copy that, come back to my CSS, go to my class for the starfish shape, the blob1 shape, and I'm going to pull out this color variable, this variable definition here, and or declaration property, and I'm going to put in URL, okay, hash character, meaning ID, then paste in that ID name. Okay, and as soon as I hit save, we should see a gradient. Boom, there we go. There's our gradient there. So that's the gradient that is defined in the SVG here. Now, one last thing. Notice that these color stops are defined in the SVG. However, because the HTML page is loading in the CSS, I can replace these colors with colors from my CSS color definitions. So I can actually come back here to my color variables and I can say, okay, I've got orange light. Just going to copy that name, come back to my HTML, go down to this linear gradient section, go to the first color stock, replace that hexadecimal value with this. Okay, you might have noticed that color change there. In fact, I've probably put that one in the wrong spot. I need to swap these over. Okay, so I've got my color called orange medium. That's what I'll use for my darker color. So again, var for variable, orange medium. Oops, it disappeared for some reason. Not sure what's going on there. Oh, missing a quote mark. That'll do it. Always something simple. Okay, so there's our gradient there. Okay. So that seems pretty good. I'm not happy with that order there. I'm just going to change that. I could simply change the offset numbers. That should work. Reverse the order there. Or probably better yet, I just sort of swap over the correct color variables. That's all in the right order. Okay, and there we have it. Got a color gradient controlled with colors from the CSS, but it is necessarily with gradients to define them in your SVG itself.